Hello. Living our lives, we do not always notice and attach importance to the things that surround us. Sometimes, a seemingly ordinary object can keep many secrets and mysteries. The story I will tell today is about one of them. David Jones is an attractive and very talented young photographer. Since childhood, he was attracted to old things and objects with history. He was never the center of the crowd. On the contrary, he always kept a little to himself. He was not interested in banal games with his peers at all. Even as a student, when everyone around was having fun, throwing parties and the like, he preferred books and his camera, without which he could not even take a step. The guy graduated with honors from the university, but he never managed to get the job he dreamed of. David took pictures for the tabloid press, worked part-time at children's parties and photo shoots. This morning, having woken up before the alarm, he lay in bed and looked at the ceiling, listening to the muffled noise of the waking city outside the window. The apartment was small, cramped and cluttered with old photographic equipment. For most, these cameras were just junk. But for David, they were true friends who helped him see the world differently. Today was another children's party. David sighed and reluctantly got up. He did not hate his job, but rather accepted its necessity as an inevitability. The times when his photos of old buildings, forgotten things, and places with deep history brought at least a little money were long gone. Now all he could do was dream and continue shooting, despite the lack of interest from the public. After breakfast, David packed his working camera and looked at the old battered camera standing on the shelf. It was his favorite model, capable of capturing what others did not notice. Today he promised himself that after the party he would find time and go to a special place, an abandoned mansion on the outskirts of the city, which he had long wanted to capture on film. The day passed in the usual bustling manner. Screaming children, smiling parents, endless requests to take a picture here and like this. As the sun began to set, David felt tired, but the thought of the old mansion gave him strength. As soon as the party was over, he quickly got ready and set off. Today it was surprisingly quiet here. There were no usual groups of tourists and people with phones, endlessly taking selfies. The place was really gorgeous for such things. A huge territory with ponds and reservoirs, beautiful lawns and nature around, gave this place an extraordinary charm. A luxurious old mansion greeted him with silence and mysterious peace. The walls were covered with ivy. The windows looked with empty eye sockets, and the door wide open invited him in. David carefully stepped inside and felt how the air around him changed, filled with invisible stories and whispers of the past. He picked up an old camera, adjusted the focus, and took a picture. The shutter clicked dully, and suddenly it seemed to David that someone was standing behind him. He turned around sharply, but saw no one. It seemed so, he thought, although inside he was already flaring up a feeling that the mansion kept something more than just the past. David continued his way inside, because he had wanted to get here for so long. This place literally beckoned to him. But the guy had no idea that all this was not just like that this was his destiny and purpose, and he did not even suspect that this evening would change his life forever. David took a few pictures, when suddenly the film ran out, and he had no choice but to go home with some disappointment. He was not too desperate, because he knew that sooner or later he would return here. The next morning, as usual, he went to shoot another children's party. The children ran, screamed, and pushed, trying to get into the lens, and suddenly one of them, miscalculating his strength, knocked David's camera off his hands. The camera fell with a crash onto the asphalt and broke. It was very painful for him. He treated such things with great trepidation. The parents hastened to calm the upset photographer. offering to compensate for the cost of the broken equipment. But this did not make him feel any better. With a feeling of sadness and a small amount of money in his pocket, David went home. On the way, he kept looking at the body of the broken camera, not noticing anyone and nothing around. But suddenly, he looked away, and his attention was drawn to an old antique shop, which he had not even noticed before, although he had passed here 100 times. In the window there were many strange things, among which he noticed an old camera. Something about it immediately attracted David, and without thinking he went inside. The shopkeeper, an elderly man with attentive eyes, noticed his interest and told him that the camera had a long and mysterious history. The old man did not often see young people who would be interested in antique things. He could talk about them for hours with great pleasure, but David, without any unnecessary questions or conversations, simply bought it and hurried home, experiencing a strange anticipation and impatience to try it out as soon as possible. Having figured out what and how, he began to photograph everything around him: houses, streets, and people around. A couple of days later, while developing the photos, David noticed something unusual. In each frame taken with the new camera, barely noticeable figures or silhouettes of people appeared, who were definitely not there at the time of shooting. Moreover, these figures were as if fogged up and looked completely unnatural. They seemed to be pointing at something, inviting David to understand the secrets of the captured places and the people next to whom they stood. David felt his heart beat faster from excitement and fear. The first thought was that all this was nonsense, something unreal. He thought that the equipment was old and there was some kind of failure when developing the photos. Having developed them again, nothing had changed, and then he realized that this was no longer a coincidence or a figment of the imagination. The photographs were trying to tell him something. A certain feeling came that now his life was forever connected with these mysterious images. David couldn't forget the strange figures that appeared in his photographs for a long time. Wanting to check it out again, he went out into the city and started taking pictures of random passers-by. Among the many faces, his attention was drawn to a young girl laughing and talking on the phone. He took a picture and hurried home to develop it as quickly as possible. When the photo developed, David's heart stopped for a second. His breath caught as if he had been hit in the chest. A vague dark silhouette appeared next to the girl, holding her by the shoulder with one hand and clearly pointing with the other towards the nearest body of water. He also noticed barely noticeable drops of water in the background, as if splashed across the photo. Trying with all his might to throw bad thoughts out of his head, at first he convinced himself that it was just an accident, his imagination, or a play of light and shadow. However, no matter what he did, nothing worked. Anxiety did not leave him. Even everyday worries and work could not distract him and forget for a second. 2 days later, turning on the TV, David froze in place. The news reported the tragic death of a girl who drowned in a city pond. The victim's face matched the one he had photographed recently. He remembered this girl, her smile and mesmerizing laugh. Among the many pictures, the young photographer tried to find the one with the girl from the TV, but he could not find it. David was overcome by panic and guilt. He realized that the camera was warning him, trying to point out the impending danger. At that moment, he realized the importance of his discovery. This camera did not just capture moments. It could show the future and warn of tragedies that had not yet happened, thereby giving the opportunity to prevent them. Now David knew that he could not ignore these signs. He decided to use his new ability to save lives. After all, now this has become a kind of purpose for him and, to some extent, the meaning of life. David continued taking photographs, hoping to prevent as much misfortune as possible and save everyone he could. From the outside, he began to look like a slightly crazy person who feverishly runs through the streets and photographs everyone regardless of their will and desire. Inside there was hope that he could help everyone, but each new photo brought only despair. First he saw a young guy, near whom a silhouette pointed to falling bricks. The guy died a day later, caught in a collapsed wall. Then there was a woman in whose photo there were signs of an accident. She was gone the next day in a car accident. Like an animal driven into a cage, he rushed among people in a state of some hopelessness. David could no longer stand it alone. He understood that he was not a hero from the movies and he needed the help of professionals. Having decided to report everything to the police, he collected all the recently taken photographs and went to the police station. However, the police officers took his story with distrust and irritation. His words seemed absurd to them, absolute nonsense, and David was taken for another inadequate madman, threatening him with punishment for false testimony and disturbing the peace. Only one young law enforcement officer, Andrew, who had been standing in the corner of the room all this time, listened attentively to David's story. Some interest was visible in his eyes, but even he could not believe in such mysticism. It all seemed too unreal, and not a single sane person would believe it. Which is not surprising because he himself did not immediately realize the full horror of what was happening. After long, exhausting, and quite emotional conversations, David, realizing the futility of his attempts to convince the police, decided to leave, so as not to bring unnecessary trouble upon himself. Before leaving, he left the last photo he took on the table. A young guy with red hair near a grocery store, which was located not far from the station around the corner. The silhouette in the photograph clearly pointed to him, and next to it there was something like fire, the flames of which were reaching out to his body with their tongues. "Hey, crazy! You forgot the photo," said one of the police officers. David turned around and replied with disappointment, "You can keep it." He lowered his head and left. Several hours passed. At the station, they were still discussing the crazy photographer. They joked about him sarcastically and laughed. Suddenly, the phone rang. They received a call, after which the police urgently went to the specified address. Arriving at the scene, they saw a horrific picture. A young guy was lying on the ground near a grocery store. Most of his body was completely burnt, but his face was almost untouched by the fire. Coming closer, the police recognized him as the same red-haired man from the photo. At that moment, Andrew realized that David was telling the truth, and all this was not nonsense or the delirium of a crazy person. The photographer himself had already seen the news, and was once again convinced that he was right. He knew that he would have to go all the way, because now his only chance was to use his gift, and save those who could still be saved, even if no one believed him or helped him. After the tragic incident near the grocery store, the police called David to the station to give evidence. This time they listened to his words attentively, with undisguised excitement. Although it was hard to believe all this, the fact remained a fact. The young man, noticeably nervous, explained that he was not involved in the deaths and did not plan anything like that. He told about his accidental purchase of a camera, which now showed him terrible omens, which he was simply trying to correct. It was not his choice, it just happened. Now his story did not seem absurd. The police offered David cooperation, and he agreed without hesitation. He began taking larger photographs of city squares, parks, and crowded places, trying to identify dangers in advance. The city was small, but it was physically impossible to photograph every resident, and this became a heavy burden for him. While continuing to perform his usual work duties, He spent the rest of the day carefully studying the photographs he had taken. Anton literally sat at his desk for hours, trying to find suspicious figures, silhouettes or signs in the photographs that could warn of new troubles. With each passing day, he increasingly felt the burden of responsibility for the lives of the city's residents. But David knew that now he had a real opportunity to save people, and he was not going to miss it. His efforts were not in vain. Thanks to his photographs and close cooperation with the police, several tragedies were prevented. He was especially pleased by the story of a young man and woman who were warned in time and saved from a tragic death. The police, together with David, literally at the last second pulled them out of the elevator, which had fallen and was flying down from the height of the 16th floor. The gratitude of the police and the happy faces of the rescued filled him with a new meaning in life, belonging to something important and necessary. One evening, he decided to organize his photographs, arranging them by date and time of shooting. Suddenly, David felt a strange anxiety. Something was wrong. He looked at the pictures for a long time and finally realized the photographs of the people who died simply disappeared, as if they had never existed. The young man felt a chill run down his spine. He quickly checked the film that had previously contained these pictures, but it contained only empty white spaces. He decided to reprint these frames anyway. The resulting images shocked him. The outlines of the same old mansion were barely visible on the empty photographs. There was a feeling that he had seen it somewhere before, but he could not understand what kind of place it was, because the outline was not clear and slightly blurred. David's heart began to beat faster. He began to sort through all the photographs of places that he had ever taken, and closer to the morning he found it. It was the same mansion that had drawn him for so long, in which he had first felt the presence of someone behind his back, but then did not attach any importance to it. Now David understood that all this was not accidental. All these silhouettes and figures in the photographs that he took, the signs that he saw, all this was part of something bigger, something more important. The guy assumed that the answers to his questions were hidden there. He had to go back there and solve the mystery that connected his camera and the old mansion. Before heading to the place, David decided to look into the same antique shop where he bought the mysterious camera. Entering inside, he again saw the elderly seller, who recognized him and nodded affably. "Hello, remember me?" David asked with anxiety in his voice. "Of course I remember, young man. How can I help you? I wanted to know more about this camera. Where did you get it from?" The seller frowned slightly, thought for a couple of minutes, and then slowly answered, "It was many years ago. One day, a young girl came to my shop, although she looked much older than her age. She seemed completely exhausted, and her eyes showed great fear and anxiety. At first, I thought she needed help. I offered her to sit down, breathe out, drink a cup of hot tea, and started asking what had happened. But the girl refused to explain anything. Her hands and body were shaking. She did not react to all my offers, as if she did not hear what I was telling her, and simply asked to buy this camera from her. As soon as I gave her the money, she literally disappeared from the shop and never returned. Since then, this camera stood on the display case until you took it." David felt his heart beat faster. Now he was finally convinced that he was on the right track. Having thanked the seller, he quickly went outside, took a few deep breaths, and headed toward the mansion. He understood that it was there that the answers to all the questions that tormented him were waiting for him. David approached the mansion. The place, once majestic and luxurious, was now used for excursions, celebrations, photo shoots, and filming. Around it were manicured lawns, picturesque glades, small ponds and cozy gazebos among flowering plants. When he came closer, the mansion's employees came out to him and offered to buy a tour ticket. David readily agreed, because this way he had a reason to start a conversation and talk to the people who worked here and knew much more about this place than he did. The young photographer carefully asked if they knew anything about the history of this place that others did not know, what kind of people lived there and what they did. One of the employees, who was resting on a bench, saw the young man's genuine interest in this building. A middle-aged woman, who sometimes gave tours here, agreed to tell him the mysterious history of the mansion. There is an old legend according to which a long time ago a very rich but childless family lived here. The woman began, looking closely at David. They waited for many years, but they never had children of their own. Having decided that the mansion was too big for the two of them, in the right wing of this building, they opened an orphanage for small children who were orphans, whose parents suffered from drug addiction or alcohol addiction. Everything was going well. The once silent and dull place was filled with children's voices and cheerful laughter. Mr. and Mrs. Watson, that was the name of the owners, organized everything for the convenience of the children. Comfortable bedrooms, a place where they could study, playgrounds and entertainment. Even the products for the spacious dining room, made in one of the rooms, were delivered weekly directly to the mansion. One day, everything changed dramatically. The food truck arrived on schedule. Usually, at this time, employees were already waiting at the door to check everything and help unload the transport. But that day, no one met them, which was completely strange. The drivers knocked on the door, but no one opened it either. They honked, knocked on the windows, called the owners, but there was only silence. They decided to call the police, who searched the entire mansion, but did not find anyone. All the people who lived here, children and adults, disappeared without a trace, as if they did not exist. That's it. David was overcome with a feeling of fear and an eerie premonition. Now he understood why this particular mansion appeared in his photos. It was here that the secret connected with his camera was hidden, and only he could solve this secret and understand what really happened all those years ago. After talking to the mansion's employee, the young photographer tried to find more information about this mysterious place. He carefully checked local archives, libraries, and online resources, but found nothing significant other than the story the woman told him. The only additional source were dubious articles from the yellow press. These articles described the couple who organized the shelter as strange and mysterious people. Their clothes and things looked unusual and eccentric. They always had numerous amulets on them, and strange drawings and symbols adorned their hands. These sources also circulated rumors that the couple had performed some kind of crazy ritual in the mansion, the purpose of which was eternal life, and that they killed all the children, the shelter's employees, and then themselves. These guesses seemed too terrible to be true to David. It simply did not fit in his head, but he felt that this was where the key to solving the mystery might lie. Deciding to return to the mansion, he prepared his camera to photograph every corner in detail in the hope of seeing clues or signs in the pictures and getting answers to the questions that tormented him. With a heavy heart and a determined look, David headed back to the old mansion, no longer doubting that his fate was forever tied to this place. He carefully photographed every room of the old mansion, every detail, down to the little things left in the closets and on the shelves. The longer he stayed inside, the more he was overcome by the feeling that he was not alone here. Periodically, he heard quiet sounds, incomprehensible rustlings, and someone's whispers, making him freeze with fear. After spending the whole day there, David returned home with the feeling that he was on the right track. He immediately began to develop the photographs. When the pictures were ready, he began to study them carefully with trepidation, and at that moment he realized the full horror of the situation. In each picture, images of people and children who once lived in the mansion appeared. They looked like ghosts, but the most terrible thing was something else. They all pointed their hands in some direction, as if they wanted to indicate the place where they should be looked for, hoping that someone would help them find peace. David needed to put all this in order, but how? Then he decided to quickly make a large detailed printout of the mansion plan. It took up almost the entire room, and he began to superimpose the received photos on it, trying to determine where the hands of children and adults were pointing. In his heart, the confidence grew that he was close to solving this tragic mystery, which meant that he would be able to help the souls stuck between worlds. After sleepless days of persistently studying all the received materials, David finally understood where exactly the ghostly hands in the photographs were pointing. This place was located between the old mansion and a small pond next to it. David decided to go there to personally check his guess. He bought a tour ticket and went to the mansion grounds. Approaching the indicated place, he began to carefully, centimeter by centimeter, study it. At first glance, nothing unusual was visible. A well-kept lawn, a colorful flower bed, beautiful trees by the pond, blank walls of the building with windows overlooking the pond. No hidden entrances or anything suspicious. Deciding not to miss a single detail, carefully photographed everything around. The walls, windows, pond water, trees, and even the lawn. Returning home, he immediately began developing the photos. When the photos were ready, what he saw on them again horrified him. On one of the sections of the lawn there was a beautiful, neat flower bed with small flowers. However, among these flowers, David saw something that made his heart freeze in shock. Among the beautiful flowers, small children's fingers were visible, reaching up to the sky, as if trying to break out of the darkness into the light. David sat motionless, unable to tear his eyes away from the terrible image. The reality of what was happening seemed absolutely unreal, absurd, impossible. But he understood that there was nowhere to retreat. He had to reveal this terrible secret to the end. The desperate photographer understood that no one would believe him, much less allow him to excavate on the territory of the mansion. He decided to act independently and secretly enter the territory at night. The night before, in a hardware store, he bought everything he needed: a shovel, a powerful flashlight, and other tools that he might need for excavation, and began to wait until the sun disappeared over the horizon. Under the cover of night, carefully avoiding cameras and lighting, David made his way onto the territory of the mansion. He hid and patiently waited for the guard to make his rounds and disappear into the building. Having made sure that the way was clear, he quickly headed to the place indicated in the photograph. David got down to business, feeling the tension and fatigue with every minute. Several hours of hard, exhausting work passed when suddenly the shovel hit something hard. Excitement overwhelmed him and inspired him to continue working with redoubled strength. Suddenly, the voice of a security guard, whom the guy did not even notice, sounded in the darkness. "Drop the shovel and raise your hands up. This is private property. You have no right to be here." David froze in fear and despair. The guard had already called the police, reporting the intrusion onto private property. A feeling of disappointment overwhelmed him, because he was so close to solving the mystery, and now everything could end in prison. He was afraid that again, no one would believe his incredible story, and he would simply be imprisoned for breaking the law, and the mystery of what happened would remain unsolved. David found himself in the police station with handcuffs on his hands. His worst fears were confirmed. No one wanted to believe him. The investigator charged him with illegal entry and damage to private property, after which the guy was put in a cell until the circumstances were clarified. In the cramped cell, David could not find a place for himself, again and again replaying the events of the last days in his head. Despair overwhelmed him. Then suddenly he remembered Andrew, the same policeman who once believed him and showed interest in his story. Gathering his courage, the photographer called the duty officer and asked him to contact Andrew. After much persuasion, he agreed to help. The next morning, Andrew was already standing in front of his camera. David told him everything about the photos, the mansion, the missing children, and the terrible discovery in the pictures. He spoke excitedly and sincerely, trying to convince the policeman to believe him again. Andrew listened attentively to the story without interrupting. His expression showed that the guy's words had made a deep impression on him. David realized that this policeman was his last hope to prove the truth and finish what he had started. Using all possible connections, Andrew managed to free the guy from the cell. Together they went to the authorities in the hope of getting support. The captain remembered the young photographer, his unusual story, and the photos he had seen earlier. Understanding the risk and possible consequences for himself, he nevertheless decided to move forward with the case. Soon official permission and the prosecutor's sanction for inspecting the territory and conducting excavations were received. The next day, David arrived at the site with the police. The work continued. The guy's heart was beating faster in his chest, anticipating horror. After several hours of exhausting work, the shovel finally came across a hidden underground entrance. The old door was boarded up from the inside, and from the darkness came a cold, damp air with an unpleasant, rotten smell. The policemen armed themselves with flashlights and began to carefully descend, plunging deeper and deeper into the darkness. David remained outside, anxiously awaiting the results. Suddenly, muffled screams were heard from the dungeon. One by one, the policemen began to run up. Their faces were distorted with horror, their hands were shaking, and their bodies seemed not to obey. Andrew tried to understand what had happened, and after a long conversation with his colleagues, he approached David. "Man, you should see this for yourself," he said, tapping him on the shoulder. Together they went down into the dungeon. Slowly they walked along a long, narrow stone corridor, lighting the way with flashlights. The air was heavy, saturated with dampness and stench. Finally, the corridor led them into a huge round room, the sight of which made their blood run cold. The light of the lanterns illuminated the room. What they saw made them simply freeze in silent horror. What appeared before their eyes was so terrible and unreal that neither David nor Andrew would ever be able to forget this moment. In the center of the room there was a massive stone table, reminiscent of a creepy altar. Around it, along the perimeter, were candles that had long since gone out, and strange, frightening pagan symbols and signs adorned the walls. On the altar lay two bodies, dried out by time, which even after so many years continued to hold each other's hands. An ancient knife stuck out of the chest of each, as if these people themselves decided to end their lives, remaining together forever. Near the altar, 4 more bodies were found, laid out in a circle. They had obviously died violently. Ancient spears with incomprehensible symbols were stuck in their remains. Their hands were nailed to the floor with nails, and their legs were tied in the shape of a cross. But the worst nightmare awaited them along the walls of the room. There were small stone tombstones, on each of which were found the tortured bodies of all 16 children, who had once lived in the orphanage. Their arms and legs were tightly tied to the slabs, and their chests were cut open, as if their hearts had been torn out while they were still alive. The faces of the little victims were distorted with pain and fear. Their jaws were dislocated, and deep marks from their desperate attempts to break free remained on the slabs. David and Andrew stood there in a daze, unable to utter a word. They realized that they had uncovered the terrible secret of the mansion, which had been buried under the feet of people walking here for so long, without even suspecting what darkness this place holds, and which would change their lives forever. After the truth about the terrible secret of the mansion was revealed, everyone who was present then and saw it with their own eyes could not come to their senses for a long time. The guys occasionally called each other. Andrew informed David about the progress of the investigation. When the police and forensic experts completed the investigation, putting an end to the story that shocked the entire country, the young people decided to meet. Having seen each other, they noticed how, in just a few weeks, their faces had drastically aged, depriving them of their former youth and sincere desire to live. The investigation found out that the couple who created the shelter, Mr. and Mrs. Watson, faced with the impossibility of having children, began to resort to the services of witches, sorcerers, and other adherents of black magic. Their desire to find eternal life and their own children took possession of them so much that they did not even notice how they themselves had turned into instruments of evil. In the room where the bodies were found, an old book was found describing a ritual that promised a new life. But instead of the promised immortality and happiness, they received only death and suffering, taking with them the lives of innocent children. After a long, difficult conversation, David and Andrew parted, each immersed in their own thoughts. Returning home, David could not come to his senses for a long time. He put the ill-fated camera in the nightstand and did not take it out again. Soon he acquired new equipment and gradually began to return to normal life, taking up shooting holidays and portraits again. It seemed that life had improved, and everything fell into place. But one night, David woke up from a familiar click. His heart sank, and a cold shiver ran through his body. It can't be, he thought, and at that moment another click, accompanied by a bright flash, came from the nightstand where the old camera was kept.